January 29th, 1945. Outside Gardelegen, Germany, a frozen farm crouched beneath low clouds. The barn leaned into the wind, boards blackened by frost, iron hinges squealing when they moved. Inside the yard and along a wire fence stood 511 prisoners, arranged badly, shoulders touching for warmth. Many wore striped jackets without buttons. Bread existed only as memory. Janek Nowak, 32, from Krak, hid his hands inside his sleeves, teeth chattering, eyes fixed on the dirt. Beside him, Marcel Dupont, 19, French fever-flushed, whispered that Americans were near, that uniforms might mean mercy or bullets. Nobody answered. Hay smelled damp and sour. Smoke lingered from earlier fires. Boots scraped beyond the trees. Engines coughed, slowed, idled. Olive-drab trucks rolled into view. Men climbed down quietly. No shouting. No flags. One soldier, Private Thomas Miller, 24, Iowa, set a crate down, lifted a loaf, and broke it with bare hands. The tear sounded soft, like cloth parting. He passed pieces forward. Sergeant Luis Ortega followed, pouring coffee into dented tin cups, steam ghosting upward. The line did not surge. Hands hovered. Prisoners watched bread travel person to person, afraid motion might cancel it. Janek expected blows. Marcel expected laughter. Instead, there was chewing, crust cracking, liquid warmth spreading through chests. Silence replaced fear. For the first time in months, the barnyard grew still, and nobody knew what came next. A guard named Karl Schultz watched from the road, rifle lowered, unsure what authority remained. Miller wrapped the remaining loaf in paper, set it down again, and waited. Cold burned noses. Coffee rattled in cups. The prisoners breathed slowly, sensing a rule had changed, yet wondering how long this fragile quiet could survive nightfall. No one moved toward the barn doors, listening for engines, boots, or orders to come. January 29th, 1945. Later that afternoon outside Gardelegen, Germany, the sky flattened into pale grey. Snow creaked under boots as the line shortened by inches. A smaller loaf rested on a crate, edges jagged where hands had torn. Sergeant Luis Ortega, 28, New Mexico, noticed how every reach paused, fingers hovering, hunger disciplined into caution. He set the bread down and stepped back. Anna Weiss, 41, Austrian, weighed less than her coat once had. Kindness, she believed, always arrived with a ledger. She expected the loaf to disappear. It did not. Coffee smelled burnt, familiar, like mornings that belonged to someone else. A tin cup warmed her fingers before her mouth. She drank carefully. Voices stayed low. A decision traveled without words. Take only what you need. Bread became a measurement, not of fullness, but of trust. Children watched adults nod permission. A man named Piotr tore his piece in half and slid it back along the crate. Teeth scraped crust. Someone coughed, then steadied. The misbelief that survival required hoarding thinned. The fear that this was a trick loosened. The loaf changed meaning with every tear. It was no longer proof of control. It was proof of minutes, enough time to chew, swallow, breathe. Engines idled outside. Inside, sound narrowed to mouths and fabric. But this was not the moment they would remember forever. Night approached, and the bread kept shrinking. Over hours, cups refilled with thinner coffee. Snow melted into mud, shoulders straightened slightly. Ortega counted heads. Anna folded paper for later. Children slept standing. Outside, engines came and went. The barn line held, fragile, waiting for whatever morning decided. No one knew if bread would appear again, or if silence would break first. Fear lingered quietly, watching hands, counting breaths, measuring trust as darkness settled. February 1945, outside Gardelegen, Germany, sleet tapped the barn roof and turned paths to glass. Trucks came and went slowly. Prisoners boarded, descended, waited again. Bread appeared wrapped in paper now, passed hand to hand with care. Marcel Dupont tucked a heel into his coat pocket like a talisman. Janek Nowak learned to tear without looking, counting seconds by feel. Fingers remembered shape even when eyes stayed low. Names replaced rumors. The other side gained faces, Miller with cracked knuckles, Ortega with tired eyes. Fear adjusted, shrinking but never leaving. A rule repeated quietly, wait your turn. The loaf traveled, broken, saved, shared. Coffee thinned, tasting more like water, yet warmth still mattered. The bread smelled sour-sweet as days stretched. One evening Anna Weiss traded her piece for thread from a tailor named Emile. She stitched a missing button onto a stranger's coat, needle-scraping fabric. The loaf had become currency, then something else. Permission to plan. To mend. To imagine tomorrow needing buttons. A short montage followed. Mornings began with head counts. Afternoons brought transport lists. Evenings ended with shared crumbs. Shoulders lifted, steps steadied, laughter flickered, brief and cautious. The barn emptied slowly. Then trucks stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. No engines, no bread. The final loaf dwindled to nothing, hands lifted, no longer searching crates but faces. Winter pressed closer. The object that had taught patience now asked a harder question. What happens when it is gone, and only the habit remains? Night settled. Breath smoked the air. The answer waited, unfinished in the cold. Early March 1945. A temporary camp near Gardelegen, Germany, thaw softened the ground into mud. Tents sagged. Rain stitched the air. On a wooden table lay one loaf, wrapped carefully. Private Thomas Miller set it down and stepped back. No orders followed, just a look. Janek Nowak suggested soup. Marcel Dupont shook his head. No pot. Anna Weiss reached for a knife and cut the bread thinner than seemed possible. Sergeant Luis Ortega poured the last coffee over the slices, dark liquid soaking crust so no one would choke. Steam lifted, bitter and familiar. They ate together. No one reached twice. The bread did not fill stomachs, but it steadied hands. Expectation of betrayal loosened, thread by thread. Pride softened into doubt, then quiet acceptance. Rain drummed tents. Mud sucked at boots. Someone laughed softly, surprised. A brief montage carried days forward. People slept closer. Blankets were shared. Names replaced numbers. Tasks divided themselves. Waiting became collective. The loaf disappeared, but the choice stayed. That night, with bread gone, the camp breathed differently. Survival no longer belonged to individuals guarding crumbs. It belonged to the group, moving as one. The object had finished its work. It vanished, leaving behind a method, fragile yet firm, ready for whatever morning arrived next. 1978, July. A community hall in Iowa. Heat pressing through open windows, cicadas loud outside. Coffee percolated on a side counter. On a long folding table sat a basket of bread, sliced evenly, crusts pale. Thomas Miller, 57, grey threaded through his hair, adjusted his tie and scanned the room. Janek Nowak, 65, leaned on a cane, steps careful. Marcel Dupont, 52, laughed too loudly, then apologized, habit unchanged. They had not seen one another in decades. No announcement drew them together. The bread did. Janek reached, tore a slice without looking, eyes closing for a second. Texture summoned cold air, hay, quiet chewing. Miller noticed and said nothing. Coffee poured. Chairs scraped. They sat. No speeches followed. The bread tasted ordinary. That was the miracle. What once measured minutes now measured years. Hands no longer hesitated. A woman named Ruth refilled cups. Someone opened a window wider. A brief montage carried the afternoon. Stories drifted. Children ran past. Laughter steadied. Bread vanished slice by slice, unnoticed. The object returned stripped of urgency, carrying memory instead. As evening settled, Miller wrapped the last piece in a napkin and slid it toward Janek. Not because he needed it, because it meant something. Janek nodded, understanding complete without words. Outside, cicadas softened. Inside, the table held quiet weight. They stood slowly, touching the wood as if it might remember them. The bread had traveled far, and now it rested, ordinary again, closing a long circle neither of them had planned. Yet all of them had carried. The hall lights dimmed. Doors opened. Summer waited, unchanged, patient. 1978, late evening, the Iowa hall nearly empty, crumbs scattered across the table. Warm air lingered. Cicadas hummed steadily. Thomas Miller, Janek Nowak, and Marcel DuPont stayed behind, hands resting on wood scarred by years of use. The basket sat empty. Coffee cooled in chipped mugs. They spoke of children, jobs, weather, not fear. The bread had already said enough. It had taught when to wait, when to share, when to trust once it ended hunger. Later it ended distance. A brief montage closed the day. Chairs folded, lights switched off, footsteps echoed. Outside, night wrapped the building. Miller took the last napkin, folded it carefully and pressed it into Janek's hand. Not sustenance, signal. Janek felt the weight and smiled. Marcel watched, silent. No explanation followed. None was needed. The loaf had become language, spoken without sound. They parted under streetlights, walking slower now, but steadier. The object that once quieted a barn had completed its work again. What remained was method, memory, and a habit carried forward. Sometimes the smallest thing teaches us how to live together. If this story stayed with you, carry it forward. Share it, and keep the line unbroken.